Your notes on the Eastern religions continued after talking about our Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So you're going to scroll all the way down on our world religion slides to slide number 51, talking about Hinduism. So that's where we'll get started today. So Hinduism, a little bit about the origins here. Hinduism, while most of the other religions we've discussed so far have a founder, Hinduism does not have a single founder. The archaeological record makes it difficult to trace the origins of Hinduism, but historians and theologians will put the founding of Hinduism roughly 2300 to 1500 BCE. So we're looking at anywhere between 4,500 years ago and 3,500 years ago. The major difference thus far between the religions we have discussed and Hinduism is that Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. Remember, polytheism is the belief in multiple gods. Hinduism is also sometimes referred to not just as a simple, single one religion, but Hinduism can be considered a collection of different cultures and different ways of life, and can be practiced and worshipped in many different ways. Now, mentioning polytheism here, some of the ancient scriptures of Hinduism, if you totaled up the gods, it would be millions of gods. And each god has their own set of beliefs and practices and how those gods are worshipped, and devotion to particular gods. We're going to mention a few of those a little bit later. Hinduism, can also be henotheistic or henotheistic, which is basically a personal god. Could be a family, or a community, or a specific culture, or a community that celebrates one particular god. Again, going off of that idea of polytheism. All right, so that's a little bit about Hinduism as a whole. So some of the scriptures I just mentioned here, the Vedas are the oldest religious texts, completed roughly 800 years BCE, and those were said to have been completed by one of the Hindu gods, Brahma. And Brahma compiled this collection of these revelations by these sages. Now, sages are holy people in a simple definition, after they were done meditating, and Brahma kind of recorded what these revelations could have been. The second, and maybe more famous, more recognizable scripture is called the Bhagavad Gita. And that was basically a collection of stories of one of the other Hindu gods, Krishna. And we'll talk about them a little bit later. Some about a little bit about the timeline here. I went through some of the other religions. Sacred texts are written. We start to see scholars interpret different belief systems and religious kind of structure to form basis of what Hinduism is about. We see the Bhagavad Gita written. We see different empires. Hinduism begins to spread rapidly in India and into Asia, Eastern Asia, Western Asia as well. And the Gupta Empire basically spread Hinduism around that region. We start to see some Hindu temples being built. We start to see the construction of other temples. I'll mention some of these later. We see other other Hindu empires, that really Muslim and Hindu empires that begin to exist in the region. And then eventually we see in the 20th century, India, which is Hinduism is the dominant religion in India. India is going to gain their independence. So a little bit kind of about the area and the timeline throughout Hindu history. These are some of the major kind of regions or major civilizations or empires here, just to show you on a map where Hinduism begins to spread. The Gupta Empire at its height there in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century. Now the Mughal Empire is actually a Muslim empire a lot of the people and I guess citizens, we'll call them, living in the Mughal Empire could be considered Hinduism. And then we see this map of India right before the 20th century there, when the British eventually are kicked out of India. These are some examples and pictures of some of the temples, Hindu temples that are built. And again, these temples were built to honor and worship different gods and Hinduism as a whole here. The Angkor Wat temple is probably the most recognizable by name, and these are where some of these temples are. Angkor Wat is in Cambodia there, which is just in southeastern Asia, but the other temples here are in northern and central India. All right, some of the fundamentals about Hinduism. The first being the human soul. The human soul, according to Hindus, is divided into these two kind of parts. And the idea is to have these parts of the soul unite. And that doesn't happen until achieving what's called moksha. Now, the world soul and the individual soul are the two parts. And again, the goal is to get those souls together. Now, Hindus sometimes, again, I just said they worship in a temple, sometimes referred to as a mandir, or sometimes shrines are used. And shrines can be placed out in public, shrines can be placed at temples, or shrines can be used, and oftentimes they are used in an individual's home or a family's place of residence. Now, there are particular holy men, we'll call them, that conduct worship at temples, but Hinduism is a very personal religion that you can practice and worship in a lot of different ways. I'll mention a little bit more about moksha in a second. Another kind of fundamental, we'll call this fundamentals part 2, is the idea of reincarnation, samsara. And most Hindus believe in reincarnation. The idea is that your life, depending on how much karma you have, the deeds that you do, eventually results in rebirth. And the more karma you have, the better karma, which I'm sure you guys have heard of karma before. Good deeds bring good karma, which puts you in a better position when you are reincarnated. The idea is that once you die, you are judged by karma. And if karma determines that you were not a good person and you did not perform good deeds, you had bad karma, you might end up as being reborn into something not so pleasant. Good karma, good reincarnation there. And again, it's a cycle. Reincarnation is living, dying, and then being reborn. And then the second major concept here, or second fundamental, as I mentioned before, is moksha. The idea is liberating, or liberation is freedom from, which is the word in Sanskrit. And you're seeking to get those souls united. Liberation or release from the law of samsara. The idea is that once you're able to obtain moksha, you break the cycle of reincarnation. And again, that's the goal, I'll go back here, to have your world soul and your individual soul united. All right, so reincarnation and then moksha there. Liberation from the idea of samsara. Now, in order to get to this liberation, in order to obtain moksha, you have to travel. I'll use that term, travel, in quotes, one of the 4 roads, and I'll go over those right now. Now, in order to obtain moksha, you can travel via the way of knowledge, the way of devotion, the way of work, and the way of meditation. Now, all of those are able to obtain moksha. Now, the way of knowledge is to basically understand what reality is, understand how spirituality and knowledge interact, and the meaning basically of everything. You are supposed to go through these 4 stages as on the road of knowledge. You're first a student, then you're a householder, then you become a forest dweller, and then you essentially become a sage. And the idea is that you move throughout these stages and you learn in each stage. There's kind of these goals within each stage that you are supposed to start to understand. Now, the idea of this ascetic here is basically what a sage is. That's the last and final stage. That's when you're able to obtain moksha here. But it is very difficult to do this. The second road to moksha is called the way of devotion. And this is devoting yourself to a god or multiple gods via public and private worship. Most Hindus today and across history attempt to do this, but you basically devote your life to faith and devotion to a personal deity, or another word for a god. The third way, or third road, is the way of works, which is religious duty throughout life, which is kind of a combination, I'll call it, of the first two. And then lastly is through meditation, which is through yoga. Now, most of us have heard of yoga before. Yoga is a Hinduism, part of Hindu culture. And it's basically concentration. You focus on your breathing, and you look within to obtain and view your real self. And eventually you want to become one with those two souls, with Brahma, who's one of the Hindu gods there. So those are some of the ways that Hindus are able to obtain liberation from reincarnation. Now, a little bit more about the Hindu gods here. I'm going to list them here. I'm not going to go over every single one of them. The idea is that there are different gods for different aspects of life. Vishnu and Brahma are probably the most recognizable. And the idea is that these gods are responsible for something. Brahma is considered the creator god. Vishnu was one of the earliest gods and the most powerful of those gods. So here's a couple of those examples of Hindu gods, and I'll have some images here in a second. Here's Vishnu, Brahma, and Shiva there, often depicted with multiple heads or multiple arms. And again, they represent and are worshipped in very different ways. Here's three more. And those are, again, some examples of what Hindu gods look like. This next slide is about the sacred mark that you see sometimes Hindus will have on their forehead. And the tilaka basically represents different things in different people. In women, it usually represents marriage, usually. Men, it represents a specific devotion to a specific god. There are different marks, forehead marks for different gods, just like there are different marks in women as well. But this is considered a very sacred aspect of Hindu culture. And sometimes it can be a symbol. As I said, different markings represent different things. Now, I'm not extremely familiar in the orders and what the different sects mean. There are different sects, S-E-C-T, and sometimes they are regionally based. There might be different marks in northern India versus in southern India. The cow is also sacred in Hinduism, even since early on in Hindu history. And it oftentimes is a symbol of heaven and earth, and it's mentioned in the scriptures. And if one were to kill a cow, your reincarnation would be into hell for as many hairs as you have on your body, which is kind of crazy to think about. The cow is often associated with a mother goddess, and the idea is that cows provide things for humanity. And that's special to Hindu culture. as I said, kind of this mother who provides for people. And, we still, not just in Hindu culture, but cows provide a lot to people today. Now, continuing, I mentioned in 1947, India is able to obtain their freedom from Britain. Gandhi is probably the most famous Hindu in recent history, at least. And he was born in the middle of the 19th century here. He dies in the late 20th century. And Gandhi is a well-educated man. He's born in India, and he basically leads the fight for India's independence against the British. And he's very often times associated with people like Jesus and Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa and people of very peaceful acts. And then the last slide kind of summarizes Gandhi's thoughts here. Believe that violence is a method of the weak and nonviolence is what really requires courage there. Now, lastly, I apologize for this map being a little bit hazy. I tried to use the same website to find these maps as the other religions. Worldwide, there are 1.2 billion Hindus. Now, they are heavily concentrated in India, the founding place of Hinduism here, you can see on this map. Over 90% of India's population practice Hinduism. And you can see there are some smaller percentages around the world, even in South America here. But most of them are concentrated in India. There's also Indonesia here. You can see this darker region. Nepal is just north of India here. Mount Everest is actually located in Nepal. You can see the political boundary here. So those are kind of the major locations of Hindus. There are 2.2 million Hindus living in the United States as well. All right, so that's Hinduism, an overview of Hinduism. Moving on to Buddhism. Buddhism is our last world religion that we're going to talk about, also considered an Eastern religion. Again, Western versus Eastern just describes the area on a map. Western religions oftentimes refer to the Middle East and Europe and the North and South Americas, and Eastern religions refer to mostly Asia. Now, Buddhism, similar aspects to Hinduism. That's why we kind of study them together. Buddhism actually also begins in India and then spreads all throughout Asia, into China, into Japan, into the Koreas. And oftentimes Hinduism and Buddhism are founded at a similar point in history, and Hinduism and Buddhism kind of split around 500 BC. Now, Buddhism specifically is founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who becomes known as Buddha. And again, similarly, it is a variety of cultures and traditions and spiritual practices and ways of worshiping the teachings of Buddha. All right, and if you look here, something important throughout history, this is a statue, a Buddha statue here. And this is a symbol that becomes associated with the Nazis. If you've ever seen this before, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Moving on here. So a little bit more about Buddha. Born around 563 BCE, dies in 483 BCE. Some scholars use the dates 480 to 400. And he's born into a tribe in present-day Nepal to a Hindu family. And his father was the tribal leader, kind of a wealthy man of status. And he basically is, his story is written for him. He was supposed to be a prince and take over a palace in northern India into Nepal. But ultimately, he decided that life was not for him. He said that material wealth or items, money, wealth, is not what life should be about. And he's never been outside the palace before, but he actually ventures outside of the palace at this point. And while outside the palace, he encounters 4 people: an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a sage. And he learns a lot of things about those 4 men. Because of this, because of venturing outside of his palace, he becomes this sage. And being an ascetic, he basically starts to practice yoga under multiple different people. Now remember, he is a Hindu. As a child, and his family is they practice Hinduism. So that's where that yoga element comes into play. Through yoga, he's able to achieve very high levels of consciousness. We'll talk about that in a little bit. A little bit more about Buddha here. He basically realizes that enlightenment, which is an awakening of the soul and of the mind, is through moderation, everything in moderation. And that basically means that you don't self-indulge in anything, and you meditate, and you breathe, and you practice yoga. And he spends 49 days meditating when he's 35 years old. And at that point is when Siddhartha becomes Buddha. And Buddha translates to the enlightened one. And that's the goal of a lot of Buddhists today, is to become enlightened. After becoming the enlightened one, after becoming Buddha, he is going to travel throughout northern India. And he actually travels with 2 brothers that he meets, and they set into motion what's called the Wheel of Dharma. And he starts to deliver, very similar to what Jesus does, travels around and delivers these sermons to people. And these people, these men, try to seek enlightenment like Buddha. And eventually they do. And they form this group, which is called the Sangha, which is this group of Buddhist monks. And that Sangha basically is like a school or a community. And it grows very quickly to 1,000 men. And over the next 4 decades, Buddha travels throughout northern India to teach people about Buddhism and to teach people about this way of life, to teach people about life through moderation and no self-indulging, and through meditation and through yoga, and to try to become enlightened. A little bit about the fundamentals here. We call these the basic tenets. There's something called the 3 marks of existence, the 4 noble truths, and the 8-fold path. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a second here. The second major idea behind Buddhism here is nirvana, which the idea of nirvana is enlightenment, is to become enlightened. And that is that in order to obtain nirvana, once you obtain this, you're able to end the cycle of rebirth, because Buddhists also believe in reincarnation. Nirvana and enlightenment can be substituted for each other, just the words themselves here. Nirvana is a state where no boundaries of the mind remain. Again, you basically become the most enlightened, the most knowledgeable person you can be. Now, enlightenment is basically a state. It says an event. It's a state of mind. And once you are enlightened, once you obtain nirvana, that's when you become, or you stop the process of reincarnation. And we went over that with Hinduism: birth, life, death, and then rebirth. All right, now I'll go over these basic tenets here: 3 marks of existence, 4 noble truths, and the 8-fold path very quickly. So the 3 marks of existence, Buddha described life as having these 3 marks, these 3 things. The first is nothing in life is perfect. The second is everything in life is changing always. And the third is that there is no soul. Instead, what carries on to the next life is a person's life's force, or that karma. Again, good karma is going to bring good reincarnation here. So those are kind of things that Buddha believes and provide the basis of what Buddhism is about. Next, we have our 4 noble truths. The 4 noble truths are the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the end of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering, which is very confusing. The idea is that suffering exists. You have to accept as people, and specifically as Buddhists, you have to accept that suffering exists. Suffering has a cause, it has an end, and the idea is that it has a cause to bring about its end, and that's what those examples are, all right? Or the Four Noble Truths are: truth of suffering, life includes pain, disease, death. It exists. The second, it has a cause. Suffering is caused by ignorance and craving, right? Not having enough in moderation, having too much self-indulgence. It has an end. Suffering can end individually if you're able to obtain nirvana, all right? But you have to take it one day at a time. And then lastly, it has a cause to bring about its end. In order to end suffering, you must follow what's called the Eightfold Path. All right, now, but you have to understand that these Four Noble Truths are true. And once you accept that they are true, you're able to move throughout this Eightfold Path to bring about the end of suffering. Now, the Eightfold Path, now you don't have to memorize these things. Again, the idea of teaching religion or teaching about religion is to have a basic understanding of how people worship and what religion means. And it's good to have this kind of well-rounded approach to religion as a whole. Now, the Eightfold Path here, the path to nirvana is through the Eightfold Path. Its goal is to focus the mind on being fully aware of your thoughts and actions by developing wisdom of the Four Noble Truths. So it's kind of this collinear relationship. There's right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And the idea is that if you have proper understanding and proper thought and proper speech and proper effort and all of these things, you're able to move throughout and understand the Four Noble Truths very intensely. All right, a little bit more about Buddhism here. So these are some of the temples. We went over a few of them in Hinduism here, and they're scattered throughout Asia. I'm going to go look at this map before we go back. But these are some of the major Buddhist temples in Asia. Now, if you look again, this is India here. We see one in northern India, into Cambodia, southeastern Asia. This is in Indonesia here. All very recognizable as Buddhist temples and very interesting and very intricate. And these are some of them in Indonesia, Burma, the pagodas of the 7th century in Burma there, India as well. I think the Mahabodhi is probably the most recognizable, the earliest as well, in the 5th century. And this is the original site where Buddha was able to obtain nirvana. It's probably the most famous there. And the other sites, the other temples and places of worship have, very popular reasons why people go see them. All right, a little bit about the timeline here. Again, right around 500 BCE is when Buddhism kind of breaks away from Hinduism, and Buddhism basically develops after a specific person. We start to see Buddhism basically spreading throughout India. King Akshoka, who is one of the early champions of Buddhism, we'll call him a patron of Buddhism, which is basically someone who is a Buddhist, who spreads Buddhism. He starts to send Buddhists to Sri Lanka, which is an island nation off the coast of southern India. 100 BCE, we start to see the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, which I'll talk about in a second. Buddhism is going to spread to China, move all over Europe, spreads to Japan, into Tibet. We see Theravada Buddhism established. We'll talk about that in a second. We see universities growing and then being destroyed. We start to see in the 19th century different world organizations around Buddhism. And eventually in the 20th century, we see the establishment of a 2,500 year anniversary. A little bit more about the ancient texts. I'm kind of going out of order here. The most sacred book in Buddhism is called the Pali Canon, which is basically a collection of teachings of Buddha. And the idea is that Buddha's teachings were passed via word of mouth. Buddha preached orally, very much like Jesus Christ. And later they were compiled into kind of two separate sets of scripture. And they were done so through what's called the Council of Monks at a Theravada school, in order to write down what Buddha taught. The second, these two separate sets of scriptures, one of them becomes the Theravada Buddhism, the other comes the Mahayana Buddhism. Again, Theravada and Mahayana. Now, the difference is how people worship. Theravada is the older form of Buddhism. They are way more focused on Buddha as an individual, meaning he is the Buddha, the enlightened one. And Theravada Buddhists are very strict in how they practice. They are kind of the typical monk that you think of when you think of a Buddhist. They often live together in a temple in order to worship Buddha. They meditate very devoutly, and they focus their lives specifically on Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism is a little bit later of a development in Buddhism. Individual people and monks are able to kind of meditate and pray. In Theravada Buddhism, monks are the only ones that can quote unquote meditate. Nirvana is more broadly attainable. They believe in Buddha, yes, but they also believe in other people that have become enlightened and also can become Buddha. But again, Theravada and Mahayana are the two types. Theravada being the more strictly practiced type. And again, they're kind of different based on geographics as well. Theravada tends to be in southern Asia, where Mahayana Buddhism tends to be in northern Asia, most of China versus parts of Burma, Thailand, India as well. Now, Buddhism today. There are about 500 million Buddhists worldwide, again, mostly located in Southeastern Asia, places like Cambodia, Thailand, China, parts of India. There are some Buddhists in the United States as well. Technically speaking, you can be Buddhist and be another religion. Again, Hinduism and Buddhism are kind of ways of life. They're not set specific religions where you have to follow a strict set of rules and a strict set of practices, much like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. I try not to bring personal matters into religion and into class, but my grandmother was actually a Buddhist. She was a Japanese American who grew up. Their parents were Japanese. She was Japanese. She was actually born in Canada, but went back to Japan right after World War II, where she eventually met my grandfather. But she was a Buddhist. And after moving back to the United States, gaining her citizenship, my father was raised Christian, but she had very strict ways of life in certain things, at least. But you could be Buddhist and be Christian, or Buddhist and a different language, Buddhist and Hindu, or other multiple religions. Now, the Buddha that we think of is pictured there, and this is more of a folklore. All right, that's how I have the word folklore there. And Buddha becomes synonymous with this belly rub. And if you rub Buddha's belly, you're able to obtain good luck and good fortune. The idea is that this is not what Buddha looked like. This was kind of a more modern, now I say modern day, and I wrote 11th century there. This is 11th century is when it starts to develop. But this is not what Buddha would have looked like. As a monk living in Asia in the 5th century there, it would have been tough to be on the larger size. Buddha would have been very skinny, meditating for hours on end a day. But this modern day take on Buddha is not the typical understanding of who Buddha was. But again, it's good to obtain good fortune. So if you ever see a Buddha, some people will keep Buddhas in their house to bring good fortune and good luck to them. So that's Buddhism as a whole, and the Eastern religions together.